Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation titled Teaching Plurilingually, Perceptions and Practices of ESL Peers in a Francophone Canadian College. My name is John Ann Dela Cruz and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we recognize and respect the Ganyangihaga people for being the traditional custodians of the island of Churchage, also known as Montreal, from which I present to you today. I would also like to acknowledge that without the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the study that I'm going to present to you today would not have been possible. This presentation is about the study that I conducted for my master's research. I will first begin by giving you an overview of the Canadian context in which I conducted this study, as well as the theoretical framework that informed my study. Then, I will go over my methods, as well as my major findings and results. I will then discuss the major pedagogical implications and limitations of my findings. As some of you might know, Canada is officially bilingual with English and French as official languages, but it's also officially multicultural, and under the Multiculturalism Act, the Government of Canada mandates the preservation and enhancement of the use of other languages, aside from English and French. However, this remains a challenge in second language education, especially in places like Quebec, where an official policy such as La Charte de la langue française actually indicates that French is the only language of government, law, commerce, communication, and education, at least officially. However, policies do not always reflect realities. We know that between 2011 and 2016, and even in the census going on right now in Canada, Canada is increasingly multilingual and multicultural, with 7 out of 10 Canadians who speak more than one language at home actually speak a mother tongue that is neither English nor French. Indeed, the site of my study, Montreal, is considered to be the most trilingual city in the country. Yet, certain problems persist in second language education. For example, many second language classrooms in Canada are still monolingually predisposed, and practices such as language mixing are discouraged because they're seen as a problem rather than an asset. Indeed, generally, most North American ESL instructional materials and programs, including those in Canada, still lack a plurilingual approach. As such, I draw from plurilingualism as a pedagogical theoretical framework to inform my study. As a theory, plurilingualism asserts that second language speakers are the locus of language use, meaning they are social actors with the agency to draw from their linguistic repertoire as flexibly as they want, as they see fit. These repertoires are composite, meaning they're made up of interconnected known languages and cultures, and this act of drawing from this composite repertoire is what we refer to as the plurilingual and pluricultural competence, or PPC, which is partial and dynamic as it goes along with learners' life trajectories. As a pedagogy, this means that plurilingual instruction draws from second language learners' PPC in order to support second language acquisition. This means that in the classroom, we encourage the use of learners' full repertoire in order to develop not only the competence in the target language, but also in their whole repertoire. There are many different examples of plurilingual pedagogies that have been widely investigated in the literature. For my study, I focused on 4. This includes translation, where students and teachers directly translate across their languages in order to negotiate and acquire new meanings and definitions. Translanguaging, where students and teachers fluidly and flexibly mix and switch across their languages in order to make meaning. Cross-linguistic analysis, which some of you might also know as comparons nos langues, where students and teachers systematically compare and contrast forms and meanings across their languages, and also cross-cultural analysis, where students and teachers systematically compare forms and meanings across languages on the basis of potential cultural similarities and differences. PPC and plurilingual identity have been widely investigated in the literature as well. For example, we know that second language learners' perceived PPC can be measured, which can be positively affected by a plurilingual instruction. We also know that learners' plurilingual identity can be affected by second language policies and programs. For example, more experienced learners recognize their plurilingual asset, especially if their programs encourage a plural approach to language learning. However, not all speakers of multiple languages identify as plurilinguals, regardless if they are more experienced or not. That said, one research problem is that we don't know much about the relationship between PPC and plurilingual identity, and how these two relate to the actual language practices that learners engaged in the classroom. As such, my study was guided by 3 research questions. First, do ESL tutors and tutees perceive PPC levels relate to their self-reported linguistic identity? Second, in what ways and for what reasons do ESL tutors and tutees draw from their linguistic repertoire in the tutoring center? And third, how do ESL tutors and tutees' PPC levels and linguistic identities relate to their plurilingual practices in the tutoring center? So I mentioned tutors and tutees in tutoring center. What do I mean by this? First, I conducted my study in a Francophone college, also known as CEGEP here in Montreal, particularly in their English Help Center. I recruited 20 adult ESL students from this college, 11 of which are tutors and 9 of which are tutees. The tutors are enrolled in an ESL tutoring course wherein they are trained to tutor ESL students enrolled in the beginner ESL course from the college. In general, my participants were on average around 22 years old. However, they can be as young as 18 and as old as 56. And this shows you the range of students that can be expected in a typical CEGEP in Montreal. My participants were quite multilingual. French is their most reported first language, followed by Spanish and also Pulaar. But English is the most common second language, which is not surprising given the context. It was interesting for me to find out, however, the variety of third and additional languages that my participants spoke. This includes Spanish, which is the most popular, probably because the college offers this as a course. Japanese, Italian, and also German were reported. Most of my participants were born and raised in Quebec, while 5 were permanent residents from countries such as Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Guinea, and the Ivory Coast. To collect data, I used a demographic questionnaire, a plurilingual identity questionnaire, the PPC scale, field observations, and semi-structured interviews. Just to give you a bit more details about my instruments, this is the PPC scale, which is a valid 22-item scale used to measure learners' self-perceived PPC levels. Some of the items are positively worded, while some were negatively worded. You can get as low as 1 and as high as 4. If the item is negatively worded, at the analysis stage, these items are reverse coded, meaning if they answered 1, they would actually get a 4 here. I developed my own plurilingual identity questionnaire for this study. Following a plurilingual framework, I gave my participants options to identify either as mono, bi, or plurilingual, and I also gave them definitions according to plurilingual theory as to what these terms mean. I also provided them a space below where they are able to elaborate more on why they chose to identify the way they did. For my observations, I used an observation grid, which allowed me to easily quantify the types and frequency of language practices that my participants engaged in as identified in the literature, as well as their purpose for engaging in these practices. That said, following an ethnographic approach to field observations, I also took notes in order to get thick descriptions about what is happening during my observations. I administered a demographic questionnaire, PPC scale, as well as the plurilingual identity questionnaire to all of my participants. However, for my field observations, I only observed 16 participants in total, which amounted to 10 pairs. This is because the tutoring center paired up the students before I conducted my study, and therefore I was only able to observe those pairs who would have their tutoring sessions on days where I'm able to be in the college. That said, over time, I did lose some pairs due to different reasons, such as sickness, availabilities, and cancellations. Finally, at the end of the study, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 3 tutors and 3 tutees, picking from my initial sample pool, particularly those participants whose answers for the questionnaire or the PPC scale might not be as consistent as I thought they would be in terms of what I observed them doing during the tutoring sessions. Overall, this study followed a mixed methods convergent design, where I tried to use both quantitative and qualitative data from various data sources in order to investigate and answer the same research question or phenomenon. For my statistical analysis, I used SPSS to run my tests, and for my qualitative analysis, I used NVivo. Now for my major findings and results. For question 1, do PPC levels relate to linguistic identities? I did find that PPC level and linguistic identity is strongly related. However, this is only true for low PPC score and monolingual identity. While this might not be surprising as this echoes trends in qualitative research, this is a novel result in the quantitative literature. Just to give you a brief overview, as you can see here, those who identified as bilingual and plurilingual have about similar PPC levels, while those who identified as monolinguals had statistically lower self-perceived PPC. More interestingly, none of the tutors in my study identified as monolingual, and none of my tutees identified as plurilingual. In order to investigate this further, I tried to look into the reasons they wrote in the Plurilingual Identity Questionnaire as well as what they said in the interview. After analyzing findings from the Plurilingual Identity Questionnaire, I found that there are 4 major reasons why students identified linguistically the way they did. These reasons include competency level, amount of language use, comfort level with their languages, as well as their personal language choice. However, the most popular one was competency level, and these 4 reasons were actually echoed by interview data. For example, here one tutor said, yes, I could speak English at a university level, French the same, it's their first language, but they mentioned that Spanish, they only spoke it at a very, very street level, and they considered this limited, and as such they thought that they would not be a plurilingual. As for question 2, I found that the tutors and tutees in my study engage in plurilingual practices very regularly throughout my observations, and particularly for a variety of pedagogical reasons. As well, I noticed that they use mostly their L1 French as well as the second language English, but also their additional or sometimes first language Spanish. More specifically, as we can see here, both tutors and tutees engage in almost equal amount of plurilingual practices, the most popular of which were translation and translanguaging. Interestingly, however, there seem to be almost no instances of cross-cultural analysis that I've observed. However, we can tell here too that tutors seem to be more aware of the pedagogical use of plurilingual practices than their tutees. However, it is also not surprising to see that because the context is tutoring center, that they mostly translated or translanguage in order to ask or answer a question. To get more details as to why exactly these students are engaging in plurilingual practices, I looked into my observation notes. And 5 themes emerged that pertain to the language domains or skills that are associated with the plurilingual practices that I observed. This includes learning grammar, learning vocabulary items, giving or receiving metalinguistic explanations, supporting student oral and written production, and also supporting oral comprehension, which seems to be the most popular in terms of my observation. Interestingly, again, these same teams came up with interviews. However, the 6 students that I interviewed talked more about how plurilingual practices really help them support each other's comprehension whenever they're speaking orally. For example, tutor 4 contextualized this as if he's giving himself subtitle in order for his tutee to understand him better. There were also additional reasons that emerged from my interview data as to why the students are engaging in plurilingual practices. This includes how such practices foster positive second language learning experience, how such practices help them create conceptual links, not just within the English course, but across the courses they take in college, and how they treat these practices as almost natural or instinctive. And the most popular one is that they perceive these practices as particularly helpful when learning a second language, particularly for beginners. As for question 3 then, I found it that all of my participants engage in pedagogical plurilingual practices regardless of their PPC scores and linguistic identities. However, it seems that tutors engage in plurilingual practices more than their tutees, which would be expected given that they are the more experienced learner in this context. And so why are these findings important? What are the important implications from these results? Globally, these results have important bottom-up implications for increasing ecological validity of already existing ESL materials and instructional methods. What I mean by that is we should look into what students are already doing, what types of practices they're already engaging, and incorporate those plurilingual practices or strategies into mainstream instructional materials and programs, particularly in ESL. Because if students are already doing it, why do we insist in shunning it in the classroom? More importantly, these practices should be introduced in teacher training for plurilingual pedagogy in order for teachers to feel more ready to teach an increasingly multilingual and multicultural classroom. And last but not least, these findings also have important implications for incorporating plurilingual lens whenever we come up with de facto or official language policies in the classroom. As we can see here, perhaps a target-only approach to language policies in the classroom may not be the most well-suited for students today. However, my study had certain limitations. I made my instruments available in English and French, particularly the questionnaires and the scale that were administered to my participants. However, the PBC scale has not been validated in French or any other languages aside from English. Also note that my sample is pretty small, and my sample is mostly composed of L1 French-speaking Canadians, and so we have to be mindful of that whenever we try to generalize or transfer my conclusions into other contexts that might differ significantly from the one that I studied. Thank you very much for coming to my presentation or watching it. Maraming salamat. Merci beaucoup. Dakala salamat. Agyamanak. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me at john.delacruz@mail.mcgill.ca, or you can also send me a message or a tweet on Twitter at jwndelacruz. Before we finish, here are my references. And thanks again.